The late September evening had settled over Little Wickham like silk draped across furniture, soft and still, with just the faintest suggestion of autumn's approach in the air. The annual Michaelmas ball at Greenvale House had drawn the entire village, as it had for 32 years running, ever since Mrs. Cordelia Ashford had inherited the estate from her late husband and declared that tradition must be maintained, whatever the cost to one's nerves or purse. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably in a chintz-covered chair near the conservatory doors, found herself perfectly positioned to observe the evening's proceedings. She had arrived as the guest of her dear friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had insisted that the fresh air would do her good, though Miss Marple suspected that Dolly's true motivation was to avoid spending the evening alone with her husband's interminable stories about his days in the colonial service. The ballroom at Greenvale House retained all the gracious proportions of its Georgian origins, with tall windows that opened onto moonlit gardens and a ceiling painted with cherubs who had watched over countless gatherings of the county's finest families. Tonight, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over silk gowns and evening dress, while the small orchestra, piano, violin, and a rather enthusiastic cello provided the musical accompaniment for an evening that promised to be memorable, though perhaps not in the way anyone anticipated. Mrs. Ashford herself, a woman of 65 with silver hair arranged in perfect waves and pearls that had belonged to 3 generations of Ashford wives, moved gracefully among her guests. She paused frequently to exchange pleasantries, her manner suggesting that she found genuine pleasure in these social obligations, though Miss Marple noticed how her fingers worried at her wedding ring when she thought herself unobserved. Near the refreshment table, Dr. Geoffrey Thornbury stood in earnest conversation with his daughter Patricia, a young woman whose beauty was matched only by her determination to marry well. Patricia's engagement to Robert Ashford, Mrs. Ashford's nephew and heir, had been announced just 3 months prior, though Miss Marple observed that the couple seemed to spend remarkably little time in each other's company. Robert, a man of 35 with the soft appearance of someone who had never known genuine hardship, was currently dancing with Miss Helen Carey, the village schoolmistress, whose plain features were transformed by intelligence and humor. The most intriguing figure in the room, however, was Mr. James Whitmore, Mrs. Ashford's recently appointed estate manager. A man of perhaps 40, with the kind of quiet competence that made him invaluable to his employer, he had arrived in Little Wickham 6 months earlier with excellent references and an air of mystery that had set tongues wagging. Tonight he stood apart from the other guests, declining invitations to dance with polite regret, his attention seemingly focused on a leather portfolio he carried with him wherever he went. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she observed the subtle tensions that ran beneath the evening's polished surface. She noticed how Dr. Thornbury's jaw tightened whenever his gaze fell upon Mr. Whitmore, how Patricia's laughter became forced when Robert partnered other ladies, and how Mrs. Ashford's smile faltered whenever she looked toward the portrait of her late husband that dominated the far wall. The evening progressed with the measured pace of English country society. Couples took their turns on the polished floor. Conversation flowed as smoothly as the champagne, and the older ladies settled into comfortable gossip about their neighbors' affairs. It was during the penultimate waltz that Miss Marple noticed Mr. Whitmore excuse himself from the ballroom, his portfolio clutched firmly under his arm. Mrs. Ashford's eyes followed his departure with an expression that might have been relief or concern. As the final waltz of the evening was announced, the Blue Danube, played with particular feeling by the little orchestra, the remaining couples took their positions on the floor. Robert Ashford, fulfilling his obligations as the engaged man, claimed Patricia for the dance, though Miss Marple observed that his attention seemed elsewhere. Dr. Thornbury bowed formally to Mrs. Ashford, who accepted with the grace of long practice, while Miss Carey found herself partnered with the village solicitor, Mr. Pemberton. The music swelled, and the dancers moved in their eternal pattern, silk skirts swirling and patent leather shoes gleaming in the chandelier light. It was a scene that might have graced any English ballroom for the past century, beautiful in its timeless elegance and comforting in its predictability. Then, as the waltz reached its crescendo, a sharp cry pierced the music, coming from somewhere beyond the conservatory doors. The orchestra faltered, conversation ceased, and every face turned toward the source of the disturbance. Through the glass doors that led to the garden, a figure could be seen running across the moonlit lawn. Young Timothy, the gardener's boy, his face white with terror. Dr. Thornbury was the first to reach the doors, followed closely by Robert and several other gentlemen. Miss Marple, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her years, found herself among the group that hurried into the garden, where Timothy stood pointing with a shaking finger toward the ornamental pond that formed the centerpiece of Mrs. Ashford's prize-winning rose garden. There, floating face down among the water lilies, was the body of Mr. James Whitmore, his evening clothes dark with water, his leather portfolio nowhere to be seen. The last waltz at Greenvale House had ended not with applause, but with the discovery of murder, and Miss Marple, her keen eyes already noting the details that others would overlook, prepared herself for what she knew would be a most interesting investigation into the darker corners of human nature. The garden held its breath in the aftermath of discovery, moonlight transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. Dr. Thornbury knelt beside the ornamental pond with professional composure, though Miss Marple noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he confirmed what everyone already knew. Mr. James Whitmore was quite dead and had been for some time. Mrs. Ashford stood frozen at the edge of the stone path, her silver hair disheveled and her pearls catching the light as her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. The composed hostess of moments before had vanished, replaced by a woman who seemed suddenly fragile and uncertain. Her fingers worked constantly at her wedding ring, twisting it round and round in a gesture that spoke of deep anxiety. Robert Ashford paced restlessly nearby, his usual languid manner replaced by nervous energy that manifested in quick, darting glances toward his fiancée and frequent adjustments to his evening jacket. Patricia Thornbury had rushed to Mrs. Ashford's side, offering practical comfort with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises, though Miss Marple observed that her solicitude seemed somewhat forced. Young Timothy, the gardener's boy who had made the grisly discovery, was dispatched to fetch Constable Hargreaves from the village. The lad fled down the gravel drive with obvious relief at having something useful to do, his earlier terror gradually giving way to the peculiar excitement that often accompanies proximity to dramatic events. Within minutes, the familiar figure of P.C. Hargreaves appeared, wheeling his bicycle through the garden gate with the methodical approach of a man who had dealt with poachers and petty theft, but never murder. A conscientious officer approaching retirement, he surveyed the scene with growing unease, clearly recognizing that this situation was beyond his usual purview. Miss Marple positioned herself on a stone bench near the rose arbor, her knitting bag in her lap and her sharp eyes taking in every detail that others overlooked. She noted the slight iridescence on the water's surface, suggesting it had been undisturbed for some time except for the expanding rings where Dr. Thornbury had touched the body. More significantly, she observed a dark smear on the stone rim of the pond, like damp earth ground against white marble, and beside it a tiny hook of rose thorn with a thread of blue silk clinging to it, fine as a spider's line. The questioning began immediately, though Constable Hargreaves' inexperience showed in his approach. He focused primarily on establishing when Mr. Whitmore had been last seen alive, a reasonable starting point that nonetheless failed to address the more intriguing aspects of the scene. The pond, Miss Marple noted, was quite shallow, barely 3 feet at its deepest point, and surrounded by a low stone wall that would have made an accidental fall highly unlikely for a man of evident coordination. Robert Ashford was among the first questioned, his status as heir making him a natural starting point. He confirmed seeing Mr. Whitmore leave the ballroom during the evening, though he seemed oddly vague about the timing. His manner was cooperative but nervous, and Miss Marple noticed how his shoes were sprinkled with grass seeds, as if he had crossed the lawn more than once during the evening. Patricia Thornbury provided more precise testimony, having noticed Mr. Whitmore's departure during a particularly lovely passage in the music. She estimated the time as being during the second-to-last dance, perhaps 20 minutes before the final waltz. Her father nodded approvingly at her precision, though Miss Marple detected a slight tension in his manner when his daughter spoke of observing Mr. Whitmore's movements. The most revealing testimony came from Mrs. Ashford herself. She admitted to having arranged a meeting with Mr. Whitmore in her study after the final dance, concerning urgent estate matters. The missing portfolio, she explained with visible distress, contained important financial documents and correspondence. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and Miss Marple observed how her composure cracked when discussing the estate's business affairs. Young Timothy, once his initial shock subsided, proved an invaluable witness. He had been performing his nightly routine of checking the greenhouse locks when he heard voices from the direction of the pond. 2 voices engaged in what sounded like a heated conversation. The exchange had lasted several minutes before ending abruptly in silence, prompting his investigation and subsequent discovery. As the constable continued his methodical questioning, Miss Marple found herself studying the assembled group with the attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. Miss Helen Carey's absence from the garden scene had been noted by several guests, though her explanation of tending to elderly ladies in the ballroom seemed perfectly reasonable. Dr. Thornbury's professional demeanor masked what appeared to be genuine distress, though whether this stemmed from the tragedy itself or more personal concerns remained unclear. The village solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, had stepped forward to assist Mrs. Ashford with the practical arrangements, his presence both helpful and somehow opportunistic. Miss Marple noted his careful attention to every detail of the proceedings, the behavior of a man accustomed to observing and remembering. Most intriguing was the question of timing and location. Why would someone planning murder choose such a public occasion and visible setting? Either the killer had been remarkably foolish or remarkably clever, and Miss Marple's experience suggested that in small communities, cleverness was far more common than foolishness. As Constable Hargreaves announced that Inspector Craddock from the county police would arrive in the morning to take charge of the investigation, the assembled guests began to disperse with obvious relief. The evening air had grown decidedly cooler, and several elderly ladies expressed their urgent desire to return home. Miss Marple remained on her bench, apparently absorbed in her knitting but actually reviewing the evening's events with methodical precision. The missing portfolio suggested professional motives, yet the heated conversation overheard by Timothy hinted at something more personal. The physical evidence, that blue silk thread, the positioning of the body, the timing of various departures from the ballroom, all pointed toward a carefully planned encounter that had gone tragically wrong. As the last guests departed and the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple reflected that Greenvale House had witnessed its final waltz of innocence. Tomorrow would bring official investigators and formal procedures, but tonight belonged to questions, suspicions, and the gradual recognition that someone among them was a murderer. Dawn brought a pale wash of light across Greenvale House, thinning the night's unease without entirely dispelling it. The lawn still bore evidence of the previous evening's tragedy. Flattened grass where hurried feet had trampled, scattered rose petals bruised and darkening, and the faint impressions left by Constable Hargreaves' bicycle wheels in the soft earth. Inside the house, Mrs. Larkin, the housekeeper, spoke in hushed tones to the maids as they prepared the morning tea, their voices carrying the peculiar mixture of excitement and dread that accompanies proximity to violent death. Inspector Craddock arrived precisely at 8:30. His motor car announcing itself with a dignified crunch of gravel that seemed to restore some sense of official order to the proceedings. A man in his 40s with graying temples and intelligent eyes, He possessed the kind of methodical competence that inspired confidence in both superiors and witnesses. Miss Marple, who had returned early from Mrs. Bantry's cottage, observed his brisk efficiency from the morning-room window and found herself reminded of a particularly capable headmaster she had once known, someone who could restore order to chaos through sheer force of organized thinking. The inspector's first action was to examine the pond in daylight, accompanied by Constable Hargreaves and a police photographer from the county seat. The scene looked smaller and somehow less theatrical in the morning light, more a garden ornament in need of attention than the stage for melodrama it had appeared the night before. Miss Marple, under the innocent pretense of taking her morning constitutional, had positioned herself near enough to observe the proceedings while appearing to feed the ducks that frequented the estate's ornamental waters. Inspector Craddock's examination was thorough and revealing. The blue silk thread that Miss Marple had discreetly collected the previous evening, now safely tucked in her knitting bag, had left its mark in a tiny tear on the stone rim of the pond. More significantly, the inspector discovered fresh scratches on the inner edge of the stone wall, suggesting that someone had braced themselves while placing or retrieving something from the water. A smear of dark soil on the white marble provided additional evidence of recent disturbance. The morning's most significant discovery came when young Timothy, eager to contribute to the investigation, produced a torn fragment of heavy paper he had found beneath the laurel bushes near the rose arbor. The scrap bore the partial heading, "Schedule of Liens, Greenvale Estate," in the formal typography used by solicitors, with a faint blue stain in one corner that might have been ink or something else entirely. Inspector Craddock accepted the evidence with a kind of calm satisfaction that suggested it confirmed rather than surprised him. Mrs. Ashford received the inspector in her morning room, where the bright September sunshine seemed to emphasize the drawn lines around her eyes and the persistent tremor in her hands. Her composure, so carefully maintained during the previous evening's crisis, showed signs of serious strain as she admitted to the estate's financial difficulties. Greenvale House, despite its grand appearance, was heavily mortgaged, and recent agricultural failures had made the situation increasingly desperate. The missing portfolio, Mrs. Ashford explained with visible reluctance, contained not merely routine correspondence, but documents that could expose the full extent of the family's financial predicament. Mr. Whitmore had been engaged not simply as an estate manager, but as a specialist in salvaging troubled properties, a man whose expertise came with an uncomfortably intimate knowledge of his client's vulnerabilities. As the morning progressed, Inspector Craddock's methodical questioning revealed a more complex picture of the deceased. Dr. Thornbury, when pressed, admitted to having known Mr. Whitmore, or rather James Whitworth, years earlier in London. The name change, while not necessarily sinister in itself, suggested a past that bore closer examination. The doctor's professional composure remained intact, but his reluctance to discuss details hinted at the knowledge he preferred to keep private. The most illuminating development came when Inspector Craddock's search of Whitmore's rooms above the estate office uncovered a collection of newspaper clippings and documents that painted a disturbing picture of the dead man's activities. Far from being merely a financial advisor, James Whitworth had apparently specialized in a particularly sophisticated form of extortion, using his position to uncover secrets and then exploiting them for financial gain. The pattern was both subtle and ruthless. Whitworth would arrive at a troubled estate, gain the trust of the Ysain owners through his apparent expertise, and then gradually uncover compromising information about family members or associates. His victims, fearing exposure, would agree to various financial arrangements that enriched Whitworth while appearing to be legitimate business transactions. Robert Ashford's interview revealed his own awareness of the estate's reduced value, though he maintained that his engagement to Patricia remained unchanged. Miss Marple, observing from her strategic position near the morning room window, noted the young man's nervous energy and the way his explanations came perhaps a shade too readily when Inspector Craddock inquired about the fresh scratch on his thumb. Patricia Thornbury's composed exterior impressed the inspector, though Miss Marple detected something forced in her manner when discussing her future plans. The revelation that her fiancé's inheritance would be considerably less valuable than anticipated cast their engagement in a rather different light, yet she insisted that her feelings remained unaltered. Miss Helen Carey, summoned from the village school, provided what appeared to be straightforward testimony about her activities during the previous evening. However, her obvious discomfort when pressed about her interactions with Mr. Whitmore suggested that their conversations had covered more than the practical matters concerning the village school. She eventually admitted, with considerable reluctance, that Whitmore had made inquiries about her background and qualifications that had seemed oddly personal for someone concerned only with estate management. The police surgeon's preliminary report, delivered to Inspector Craddock in the early afternoon, confirmed what Miss Marple's keen observation had already suggested. Mr. Whitmore had died from a blow to the head, not drowning. The shallow pond had merely served as a disposal site, transforming the investigation from a possible accident or struggle into a clear case of premeditated murder. As the day wore on, the village hummed with speculation and gossip. At the local bakery, Mrs. Gribble declared to anyone who would listen that she had always found Mr. Whitmore a bit too slick, while the gathered villagers nodded with the wisdom of hindsight. The transformation of the estate manager from respected professional to suspected blackmailer provided ample fuel for conversation, though Miss Marple noted that genuine grief seemed notably absent from the community's reaction. By evening, Inspector Craddock had established a clear framework for the investigation. The financial difficulties of the estate, combined with Whitmore's apparent blackmail activities, provided multiple motives for murder. The missing portfolio suggested that the killer had been seeking to suppress specific information, while the physical evidence pointed to a carefully planned encounter that had escalated beyond anyone's intentions. Yet Miss Marple, settling into her chair by the cottage window with her evening knitting, found herself troubled by elements that didn't quite fit the emerging pattern. The blue silk thread continued to puzzle her, as did the timing of the murder during such a public occasion. Most intriguingly, she had observed something during the day's interviews that seemed to have escaped Inspector Craddock's attention: genuine sorrow in one person's reaction to Whitmore's death, an emotion that seemed inconsistent with the picture of a calculating blackmailer. As darkness settled over Little Wickham, Miss Marple reflected that while the investigation had revealed secrets enough to satisfy any number of motives for murder, the truth likely lay not in the obvious financial machinations, but in the quieter human emotions that her years of observation had taught her to recognize beneath the surface of village propriety. The Last Waltz had indeed ended, but the complex dance of human nature was far from over. The morning brought Inspector Craddock back to Greenvale House with renewed purpose, his methodical mind having processed the previous day's revelations into a clearer framework for investigation. The autumn air carried a crisp clarity that seemed to sharpen both observation and deduction, though Miss Marple, positioned once again in her strategic location near the morning room, noted that clarity of atmosphere did not necessarily translate to clarity of motive in the human heart. The inspector's first significant discovery came during his examination of items found in the ballroom after the guests' hurried departure. Among the forgotten gloves and misplaced dance programs, one particular program caught his attention, water-stained and bearing a penciled notation in the margin: Arbor 1045, J.W. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, and the timing corresponded precisely with the period when Mr. Whitmore had been seen leaving the ballroom. When presented with the program, Robert Ashford examined it with obvious bewilderment, insisting he had mislaid his own program early in the evening and had never seen this particular one before. Mrs. Larkin, the housekeeper, proved invaluable in providing the domestic details that official investigations often overlooked. Her morning rounds had revealed several intriguing particulars. Patricia Thornbury's maid had spent considerable time mending a tear in her mistress's blue georgette evening gown, explaining it as damage from a rose thorn. More significantly, Mrs. Ashford had requested that the study fire be lit unusually early, and the servants had noticed the distinctive smell of burning paper emanating from the room shortly after dawn. Inspector Craddock's examination of Mrs. Ashford's study yielded perhaps the most revealing evidence yet discovered. Miss Marple, arriving with the innocent purpose of returning a borrowed book, happened to mention a childhood game involving blotting paper and pencil rubbings, a technique that could reveal the impressions of previously written messages. The inspector, intrigued by this suggestion, carefully applied a soft pencil to the fresh blotter on Mrs. Ashford's desk. Gradually, ghostly letters emerged. "My dear R, we cannot meet in the house. The garden will be less observed. Bring the portfolio. C." The revelation sent subtle ripples through the investigation's direction. The note, clearly written by someone whose initial was C, suggested a prearranged meeting between the writer and someone designated as R. The obvious interpretation pointed toward Mrs. Cordelia Ashford arranging a clandestine encounter with Robert, though Miss Marple found herself troubled by elements that didn't quite align with this straightforward reading. Young Timothy, when questioned again about the voices he had overheard by the pond, provided additional details that his initial shock had obscured. One voice, he recalled, had possessed a slight whistle on the letter S, as if the speaker had a loose dental filling. The other voice had used the phrase, "my dear," twice, first softly, almost pleadingly, then with sharp anger. Timothy's demonstration of the tonal difference proved remarkably precise, suggesting genuine observation rather than imagination. The morning's most startling development came during Inspector Craddock's interview with Miss Helen Carey. The school mistress, who had maintained her composure throughout the previous day's questioning, arrived at Greenvale House in a state of barely controlled agitation. Her night had been sleepless, spent wrestling with a conscience that finally demanded confession of truths she had hoped to keep buried. Under gentle but persistent questioning, Helen revealed that her relationship with James Whitmore was far more complex than she had initially indicated. The man the village knew as the estate manager had once been James Carey, her younger brother, estranged from the family for 15 years following a scandal that had driven him from their childhood home. His name change to Whitmore had been part of his attempt to escape a past marked by increasingly desperate financial schemes and questionable associations. Helen's revelation recontextualized much of the previous evening's events. Her visible distress at learning of the murder now made perfect sense, as did her careful attention to Whitmore's activities since his arrival in Little Wickham. She had recognized him immediately, but had chosen to maintain the fiction of their being strangers, fearing that acknowledgement of their relationship would compromise her respected position in the community. The siblings had indeed spoken privately during the ball, their conversation taking place near the conservatory doors, where several guests had observed what they had interpreted as a romantic encounter. In reality, James had approached Helen seeking reconciliation and forgiveness, while she had firmly rejected his overtures, warning him that she would not allow his presence to threaten her carefully constructed respectability. Inspector Craddock's methodical search of the pond area yielded one additional piece of evidence that had been overlooked in the previous evening's confusion. Half buried in the soft earth near the stone rim was a small mother-of-pearl button, delicately fashioned and clearly feminine. The button showed no signs of weathering, suggesting it had been lost recently, and its style indicated quality clothing of a somewhat old-fashioned design. As the morning progressed, the case against Robert Ashford appeared to strengthen considerably. His nervous demeanor, combined with his inability to provide a coherent account of his movements during the critical period, created an impression of guilt that Inspector Craddock found increasingly compelling. The fresh scratch on Robert's thumb, when examined more closely, proved consistent with contact with rose thorns, while grass stains on his evening shoes confirmed his presence in the garden during the relevant time frame. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by aspects of the emerging narrative that seemed to resist easy explanation. The blue silk thread she had discreetly collected remained unaccounted for in the official theory, as Robert's evening clothes contained no silk of that particular shade. More significantly, her observation of human nature suggested that Robert Ashford, whatever his financial desperation, lacked the decisive ruthlessness required for premeditated murder. The question of timing also presented difficulties that the official investigation seemed reluctant to address. If Robert had indeed killed Whitmore during their supposed confrontation by the pond, the sequence of events required a level of calculation and composure that seemed inconsistent with his obviously agitated state throughout the evening. Dr. Thornbury's interview provided additional complexity to the investigation. His admission of prior acquaintance with Whitworth in London had matured overnight into a more detailed account of their past association. The doctor revealed that Whitworth had once been involved in a financial arrangement that had ended disastrously for one of his patients, a vulnerable widow who had been left both financially ruined and emotionally devastated. Dr. Thornbury's dislike of the man was thus rooted in professional ethics as much as personal antipathy. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Greenvale House's elegant rooms, Inspector Craddock began to formulate his theory of the crime. The evidence seemed to point toward a confrontation between Mrs. Ashford and Robert, arranged through the note discovered on the blotter, that had somehow escalated to include Whitmore and had ended in his death. The missing portfolio, the burned papers in the study fireplace, and Robert's obvious guilt all supported this interpretation. Miss Marple, however, found herself considering alternative possibilities that the official investigation had not yet explored. The mother-of-pearl button suggested the presence of someone whose involvement had not been fully recognized, while Helen Carey's revelation about her brother's true identity opened entirely new avenues of motive and opportunity. Most intriguingly, Miss Marple had observed throughout the day a subtle current of genuine grief that seemed inconsistent with the emerging picture of Whitmore as a calculating blackmailer. Someone among the ball's attendees had cared for the dead man in ways that transcended mere professional or financial relationships, and Miss Marple's experience suggested that such emotions often held the key to understanding the darker currents that led to murder. As evening approached and the investigation prepared to enter its next phase, Miss Marple reflected that the Last Waltz at Greenvale House had indeed marked the end of an era of innocence for Little Wickham. Yet she suspected that the true complexity of human motivations behind that night's tragedy had only begun to reveal itself, and that the most significant revelations still lay ahead. The pattern was becoming clearer in her mind, though several crucial elements remained to be woven into place before the full design would emerge. Tomorrow would bring new questions and, she hoped, the answers that would finally illuminate the truth behind the deceptive elegance of that fatal evening. The morning brought Inspector Craddock back to Greenvale House with renewed purpose, though Miss Marple, observing from her strategic position near the conservatory, sensed that the investigation was approaching a critical juncture where obvious conclusions might obscure more subtle truths. The autumn air carried a crispness that seemed to sharpen both observation and deduction, yet she had learned that clarity of atmosphere did not necessarily translate to clarity of motive in the complex landscape of human nature. Mrs. Bantry's unexpected arrival at the cottage shortly after breakfast had provided a crucial new piece of testimony. During the ball's festivities, she had stepped onto the terrace for fresh air and observed what appeared to be an intimate conversation between two figures in the rose arbor. The moonlight had revealed one participant as clearly feminine, wearing pale silk, while the other remained partially obscured by shadows. Most significantly, she had distinctly heard the woman's voice raised in what sounded like passionate pleading, though the actual words remained indistinguishable. Inspector Craddock's examination of this new information led to perhaps the morning's most significant discovery. The blue silk thread that Miss Marple had discreetly collected from the pond's rim proved, when compared with Patricia Thornberry's mended evening gown, to be an exact match. The cream silk showed evidence of careful cleaning around the hem, where faint stains suggested contact with damp earth, while a small tear near the sleeve had been expertly repaired by her maid. The revelation came through Mrs. Larkin's meticulous attention to household details. Patricia's maid had worked early that morning to repair the damage, explaining it as the result of catching the fabric on rose thorns. Yet when Miss Marple gently examined the mended areas, the blue silk thread lay against the repaired hem like a chameleon finding home, providing tangible evidence of Patricia's presence near the pond during the critical time frame. Young Timothy's continued cooperation yielded another crucial discovery. Hidden beneath a loose stone in the garden wall, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a small leather notebook in James Whitmore's distinctive handwriting. The entries painted a disturbing picture of systematic exploitation extending far beyond Greenvale House, revealing a carefully orchestrated network of genteel extortion that had ensnared several financially distressed families throughout the county. Most damaging were the final entries, dated just days before the ball. Whitmore had recorded a meeting with someone identified only as C, who had offered him a substantial sum to cease his activities and leave the district quietly. This proposal had been rejected, with Whitmore noting that his investment in the local situation was too valuable to abandon. A subsequent entry, made on the very day of the ball, recorded his intention to conclude the arrangement permanently, during a meeting scheduled for that evening. Inspector Craddock's methodical search of Mrs. Ashford's study had revealed additional evidence of document destruction. In the fireplace ashes, careful sifting uncovered fragments of heavy paper consistent with legal documents, along with traces of red sealing wax that suggested the destruction of formally executed agreements. The crystal paperweight on the blotter appeared curiously pristine given the ash still gray in the grate, while the blotter itself continued to yield secrets. Miss Marple's suggestion about childhood games involving blotting paper and pencil rubbings had proven remarkably fruitful. The ghostly letters that emerged revealed, "My dear R, we cannot meet in the house. The garden will be less observed. Bring the portfolio. C." Yet when compared with Mrs. Ashford's natural handwriting on nearby documents, the capital C showed telling differences. The curved flourish of Cordelia's usual signature, replaced by a plain, almost parsimonious letter that suggested deliberate disguise. Dr. Thornberry's second interview revealed the personal dimension of Whitmore's threats. Beyond his professional disapproval of the man's past conduct, the doctor admitted to receiving subtle threats regarding his daughter's reputation. Whitmore had somehow learned of Patricia's brief involvement, years earlier, with a married man, a scandal that had been carefully concealed, but which could have destroyed her chances of making a respectable marriage. The revelation cast Patricia's engagement to Robert Ashford in a different light, representing not merely romantic attachment, but crucial social rehabilitation. Any threat to expose her past indiscretions would have been devastating to both her immediate happiness and long-term security. Her remarkable composure throughout the investigation, which Miss Marple had noted with interest, now appeared to require considerable effort to maintain. The case against Robert Ashford continued to strengthen with each piece of evidence. His nervous demeanor, the fresh scratch on his thumb consistent with rose thorns, grass stains on his evening shoes, and his inability to provide a coherent account of his movements during the critical period all contributed to Inspector Craddock's growing conviction. The village gossip, filtering through Mrs. Gribble at the bakery, revealed recent public arguments between Robert and Patricia about his gambling debts and reckless spending, providing additional motive for confronting Whitmore. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by elements that resisted the neat pattern emerging from the official investigation. The mother-of-pearl button discovered near the pond remained unmatched to any clothing worn by the obvious suspects, while Mrs. Larkin's identification of it as belonging to an antique set of gentlemen's waistcoat buttons from the house's storage suggested a different narrative entirely. Most puzzling was the genuine grief she continued to observe in one person's demeanor, an emotion that seemed inconsistent with the calculated nature of the apparent crime. Timothy's description of the whistling S in one of the overheard voices, combined with his hesitant identification of Dr. Thornberry, added another layer of complexity that the official theory struggled to accommodate. As evening approached and Inspector Craddock prepared to formalize his case against Robert, Miss Marple reflected that the Last Waltz at Greenvale House had indeed marked the end of innocence for Little Wickham. Yet she suspected that the true complexity of human motivations behind that night's tragedy was only beginning to reveal itself, and that the most significant revelations still lay hidden beneath the surface of village propriety. The blue silk thread had provided one crucial connection, but Miss Marple's experience suggested that in matters of murder, the most obvious threads often led away from, rather than toward, the truth. The morning brought Inspector Craddock to Greenvale House with renewed determination, his methodical mind having organized the previous day's revelations into what appeared to be a compelling case against Robert Ashford. The young man's nervous demeanor, combined with the accumulating physical evidence, had convinced the inspector that an arrest was imminent. Yet Miss Marple, positioned once again in her strategic observation post near the conservatory, sensed undercurrents that the official investigation had not yet recognized. Mrs. Larkin's morning discovery provided the first significant development of the day. While conducting her systematic inventory of the house's stored clothing, a task prompted by the mysterious mother-of-pearl button found near the pond, she made a revelation that shifted the investigation's focus entirely. The button belonged to a complete set that had adorned her late master's formal waistcoats, garments that had been carefully preserved in the estate's storage rooms since Mr. Ashford's death. The housekeeper's meticulous records revealed that one waistcoat from the collection had been borrowed just days before the ball. Mr. Pemberton, the village solicitor, had requested it after claiming that his own formal wear had lost a button during his train journey to Little Wickham. Mrs. Larkin had accommodated his request, providing him with one of the antique waistcoats to maintain his dignity when escorting Mrs. Ashford during the evening's formal proceedings. This revelation cast Mr. Pemberton in an entirely new light. Miss Marple recalled Timothy's description of the whistlings in one of the voices overheard by the pond, a speech pattern that several villagers had noted in the solicitor's careful diction. The connection between the button, the borrowed waistcoat, and Pemberton's presence near the scene during the critical time frame created a compelling alternative to the case against Robert. The morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Mrs. Pemberton, the solicitor's wife, whose insomnia had positioned her at her bedroom window during the crucial hours of the ball. Her testimony proved both detailed and disturbing to the established timeline. She had observed not two figures meeting in the garden, as previously assumed, but three distinct individuals converging near the rose arbor in what appeared to be a planned encounter. According to Mrs. Pemberton's account, a feminine figure in pale evening dress had arrived first, followed by a masculine figure in formal attire. Their conversation had appeared animated, with gestures suggesting disagreement or urgent pleading. Most significantly, she had then witnessed a third person approaching from the direction of the house, moving with evident purpose across the moonlit lawn. The arrival of this third party had transformed the nature of the encounter entirely, leading to what appeared to be an intense confrontation involving all three participants. Inspector Craddock's continued investigation of the burned papers in Mrs. Ashford's study yielded perhaps the most shocking revelation yet uncovered. Hidden beneath seemingly innocent household correspondence lay a collection of letters that revealed a relationship between the widow and James Whitmore that extended far beyond professional estate management. The correspondence painted a complex picture of growing intimacy between two people bound together by financial necessity and mutual attraction. Whitmore's letters revealed genuine affection alongside his professional assessments, while Mrs. Ashford's carefully composed responses showed a woman torn between emotional attachment and moral awareness of the compromises her situation demanded. The final letter in the collection, dated the day before the ball, contained Whitmore's proposal of marriage combined with his offer to abandon his extortion activities and begin a new life together, using profits from a lucrative London transaction. Mrs. Ashford's reply, found in draft form among her private papers, had been a careful rejection that cited the impossibility of their union given the questionable nature of his business practices. While Inspector Craddock pursued these more dramatic revelations, Miss Marple continued her methodical examination of smaller details that others had overlooked. Her visit to the library, ostensibly to return a borrowed book, revealed traces of violet perfume lingering in the air, a scent she associated with the heavy cream paper used for formal correspondence. Her examination of the writing desk in the library corner proved particularly illuminating. Using the childhood technique of pencil rubbings on blotting paper, she discovered the faint impressions of practiced writing. Someone had repeatedly attempted the opening phrase, "My dear R," before achieving the confidence necessary to compose the full note discovered in Mrs. Ashford's study. Most intriguingly, her inspection of the ballroom piano revealed a small twist of paper containing 2 crushed violet petals and a single fair hair, fine and masculine in texture. The discovery suggested an intimate moment between 2 people during the evening's festivities, though the identity of the participants remained tantalizingly unclear. Mrs. Larkin's systematic approach to household management yielded another crucial piece of evidence when she discovered, hidden in the umbrella stand, a thin metal rod wrapped with frayed blue silk. The rod had been missing from the greenhouse blinds for several weeks, and its reappearance in such an unusual location, stained with what appeared to be dried blood, suggested its use as an improvised weapon. The blue silk wrapping matched exactly the thread Miss Marple had discreetly collected from the pond's rim, providing a direct connection between Patricia Thornberry's damaged gown and the instrument that had likely caused Whitmore's death. Yet the rod's placement in the umbrella stand suggested someone unfamiliar with household geography, or someone deliberately attempting to implicate another party. As the day progressed, the investigation revealed a web of relationships and motives far more complex than anyone had initially suspected. Robert Ashford's obvious guilt began to seem less certain as other suspects emerged with equally compelling reasons for wanting Whitmore dead. The financial pressures facing the estate, combined with the personal relationships that had developed around the charismatic but dangerous estate manager, created multiple pathways to murder. Dr. Thornberry's continued reluctance to discuss his past association with Whitmore suggested secrets yet to be revealed, while Helen Carey's genuine grief for her brother contrasted sharply with the calculating blackmailer others described. Patricia's damaged gown and nervous behavior might indicate guilt or merely the natural anxiety of someone whose reputation hung in the balance. Miss Marple, synthesizing all these revelations through her years of experience with human nature, began to perceive a pattern that the official investigation had not yet recognized. The murder of James Whitmore had not been the result of a simple confrontation between blackmailer and victim, but rather the tragic culmination of multiple relationships and pressures converging on a single fatal evening. The 3 figures observed in the garden, the borrowed waistcoat with its missing button, the carefully practiced note, and the improvised weapon, all suggested a crime that was simultaneously planned and spontaneous, carefully arranged by one party, but escalating beyond anyone's control when additional participants arrived at the scene. As evening approached and Inspector Craddock prepared to formalize his case against Robert Ashford, Miss Marple reflected that the last waltz at Greenvale House had indeed marked the end of innocence for little Wickham. Yet she suspected that the true complexity of guilt and innocence in this matter was only beginning to reveal itself, and that the most significant revelations about human nature and the price of secrets were still to come. The pattern was becoming clearer in her methodical mind, though several crucial elements remained to be woven into place before the full design would emerge. Tomorrow would bring new questions, and, she hoped, the answers that would finally illuminate the truth behind the deceptive elegance of that fatal evening. The morning brought Inspector Craddock back to Greenvale House with the weight of accumulated evidence pressing upon his methodical mind. Yet Miss Marple, settling into her familiar observation post near the conservatory windows, sensed that the investigation was approaching a moment of critical revelation where the obvious might prove dangerously misleading. The autumn air carried that peculiar clarity that comes before significant weather changes, and she had learned that such atmospheric shifts often coincided with equally dramatic shifts in human affairs. Mrs. Larkin's systematic morning inventory had yielded perhaps the most significant development yet uncovered. Her discovery that the mother-of-pearl button belonged to her late master's formal waistcoats, and that Mr. Pemberton had borrowed one of these very garments for the ball, transformed the solicitor from peripheral figure to central suspect. The housekeeper's meticulous records showed that Pemberton had requested the waistcoat just days before the ball, claiming his own formal wear had suffered damage during his journey to Little Wickham. This revelation cast Timothy's earlier testimony about the whistling shrew in an entirely new light. Several villagers had noted this distinctive speech pattern in Mr. Pemberton's careful diction, a minor dental irregularity that he had learned to minimize but could not entirely eliminate under stress. When Inspector Craddock attempted to locate the solicitor for questioning, however, he discovered that Pemberton had mysteriously absented himself from both his home and office, leaving behind only his wife's vague explanation that he had gone to fetch air the previous evening and had not returned. The morning's most startling discovery came through young Timothy's continued eagerness to assist the investigation. His intimate knowledge of the estate's grounds had led him to conduct his own exploration of the murder scene, where he had found, carefully hidden beneath a loose stone near the pond, a small silver locket bearing the initials C.A. in elegant script. The locket contained a photograph of the late Mr. Ashford and showed signs of recent damage to its clasp, as though it had been torn away during a struggle. When presented with this evidence, Mrs. Ashford's carefully maintained composure finally cracked entirely. Her admission that the locket had belonged to her and had been missing since the night of the ball forced Inspector Craddock to confront the uncomfortable reality that his primary witness had been deliberately concealing her presence at the scene during the critical moments. The implications were profound and disturbing, suggesting that the widow's account of remaining in the ballroom throughout the evening had been a carefully constructed deception. Miss Marple's gentle conversation with Helen Carey during the schoolmistress's lunch break revealed additional layers to the tragedy that the official investigation had not yet recognized. Helen's genuine grief for her brother, combined with her obvious relief at finally sharing the burden of their relationship, painted a picture of a woman torn between family loyalty and moral conscience. Her revelation that she had witnessed James arguing with a woman in pale evening dress near the rose arbor provided crucial confirmation of Patricia Thornbury's presence at the scene, though Helen's inability to clearly identify the woman in the dim moonlight left room for interpretation. Dr. Thornbury's third interview with Inspector Craddock unveiled the personal dimension that had driven much of the evening's tragedy. His past association with James Whitworth in London had involved a specific incident that haunted his medical conscience. A vulnerable widow patient who had been convinced by Whitworth to invest her entire inheritance in a fraudulent scheme, ultimately contributing to her death from despair and destitution. The doctor's recognition of Whitworth upon his arrival in Little Wickham had created an impossible ethical dilemma. His duty to protect his patients, conflicting with his inability to expose the man without violating medical confidentiality. The investigation's most puzzling development came with the discovery of additional evidence in Mrs. Ashford's private study. Inspector Craddock's examination of papers that had escaped the previous night's burning revealed a collection of letters that exposed a romantic relationship between the widow and James Whitmore, extending far beyond professional estate management. The correspondence painted a complex picture of growing intimacy between two people bound together by financial necessity and genuine affection, culminating in Whitmore's proposal of marriage and his offer to abandon his extortion activities for a new life together. Mrs. Ashford's draft reply to this proposal, found among her private papers, had been a careful rejection, citing the impossibility of their union given the questionable nature of his business practices. Yet Miss Marple noted that the letter's tone suggested genuine regret rather than moral outrage, indicating that Mrs. Ashford's feelings for Whitmore had been more complex than anyone had suspected. The morning's most disturbing revelation came through Mrs. Pemberton's insistence on providing additional testimony about her sleepless vigil at the bedroom window. Her account of 3 separate arrivals at the Rose Arbor painted a picture of escalating complexity that no single theory of the crime could adequately explain. The first figure had moved with determined steps, keeping what appeared to be a planned appointment. The second arrival had approached more cautiously, pausing frequently as if uncertain about proceeding. The third figure had emerged from the house with obvious urgency, crossing the lawn in a direct line that suggested intimate knowledge of the garden's layout. Miss Marple's examination of the conservatory and library areas revealed subtle traces that others had overlooked. The persistent scent of violet perfume that seemed to mark a path through the house like an invisible trail. Her childhood technique of using pencil rubbings on blotting paper had revealed repeated attempts to write, "My dear R," before the final note had achieved the confidence necessary for completion. Most intriguingly, her inspection of the ballroom piano had uncovered a small twist of paper containing crushed violet petals and a single fair hair, fine and masculine in texture, suggesting an intimate moment between two people during the evening's festivities. The missing greenhouse blind rod, discovered wrapped in blue silk in the umbrella stand, provided the murder weapon, but its placement seemed almost deliberately obvious, as though intended to direct suspicion toward a particular individual. The blue silk wrapping matched exactly the thread Miss Marple had discreetly collected from the pond's rim, providing a direct connection to Patricia Thornberry's damaged evening gown, yet the rod's location in the house suggested someone unfamiliar with domestic geography or someone deliberately attempting to implicate another party. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Greenvale House's elegant rooms, Inspector Craddock found himself facing a case of unprecedented complexity. The simple narrative of financial desperation leading to murder had evolved into a web of relationships, secrets, and competing motives that defied easy resolution. Each new piece of evidence seemed to implicate another suspect, while simultaneously providing alibis or alternative explanations for those previously considered guilty. Patricia Thornberry's composed exterior, which had initially impressed the inspector as evidence of innocence, now appeared to mask a more calculating intelligence than anyone had suspected. Her careful attention to maintaining her alibi, combined with the physical evidence linking her to the scene, suggested someone who had anticipated the need to conceal her involvement in the evening's events. Yet Miss Marple, observing the investigation's progress with her characteristic patience, had noted something that escaped the official inquiry's attention: genuine sorrow in one person's reaction to Whitmore's death, an emotion that seemed inconsistent with the calculated nature of the apparent crime. This individual had consistently deflected suspicion, remained largely in the background, and offered seemingly innocuous observations that had subtly guided the investigation's direction. The pattern was becoming clearer in her methodical mind, though several crucial elements remained to be woven into place before the full design would emerge. The violet perfume trail, the repeated practice of the note's opening phrase, the intimate moment at the piano, and the careful placement of evidence all suggested a crime that was simultaneously planned and spontaneous, carefully orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of human nature and village society, yet escalating beyond anyone's control when multiple participants converged at the fatal scene. As evening approached, and Inspector Craddock prepared to formalize his case against the most obvious suspect, Miss Marple reflected that the last waltz at Greenvale House had indeed marked the end of innocence for little Wickham. The elegant surface of village propriety had been stripped away to reveal the darker currents of human nature that flowed beneath, currents that had ultimately converged in violence and death. Tomorrow would bring the moment of truth, when all the carefully maintained deceptions would collapse and the real murderer would be revealed. Miss Marple sensed that this revelation would surprise everyone, including Inspector Craddock, for the true killer was someone who understood the intricate dance of village society well enough to orchestrate events and manipulate perceptions with quiet, deadly precision. The last waltz had ended in murder, but the melody of deceit was still playing, and only the most careful listener could detect the final discordant note that would bring the tragic symphony to its inevitable conclusion. The morning brought Inspector Craddock back to Greenvale House with the weight of accumulated evidence pressing upon his methodical mind. Yet Miss Marple, settling into her familiar observation post near the conservatory windows, sensed that the investigation was approaching a moment where the obvious might prove dangerously misleading. The autumn air carried that peculiar clarity that comes before significant weather changes, and she had learned that such atmospheric shifts often coincided with equally dramatic revelations in human affairs. The first significant development came through young Timothy's continued dedication to the investigation. His intimate knowledge of the estate's grounds had led him to discover, carefully concealed beneath loose stones in the old garden wall, a small leather journal wrapped in oilcloth. The journal bore James Whitmore's distinctive handwriting, but its contents painted a picture that contradicted everything the investigation had assumed about the dead man's character and motivations. Rather than records of extortion and blackmail, the journal contained carefully drafted letters of apology to various individuals, along with detailed calculations of restitution payments. The entries revealed a man wrestling with his conscience and planning redemption, someone who had recognized the moral bankruptcy of his recent activities and sought to make amends. Most significantly, the final entry, dated the very day of the ball, recorded his intention to make a clean breast of everything tonight, and his hope that those I have wronged will understand when they learn the truth about my circumstances and intentions. This revelation prompted Inspector Craddock to reconsider the entire framework of the case. If Whitmore had been planning confession and restitution rather than continued exploitation, the motives for his murder shifted dramatically. The financial pressures that had seemed so compelling as causes for violence now appeared insufficient to explain the calculated nature of the crime. Mrs. Larkin's systematic approach to household management provided another crucial discovery when she found, tucked behind books in the library, a small silver flask engraved with the initials J.W.'s. The flask contained traces of brandy, but also showed residue of a bitter substance that Miss Marple's experience with village ailments suggested might be digitalis. When Dr. Thornberry was consulted about this finding, his professional composure showed the first significant crack since the investigation began. The doctor's admission that he had once treated Whitmore for a weak heart condition, requiring careful dosing of digitalis drops, introduced an entirely new dimension to the murder. The possibility that Whitmore's death had resulted not merely from the blow to his head, but from a combination of physical trauma and cardiac distress brought on by medication tampering suggested a killer with specific medical knowledge and access to dangerous substances. Miss Marple's request to examine the library more thoroughly yielded additional evidence that others had overlooked. Her childhood technique of using pencil rubbings on blotting paper revealed repeated attempts to write "My dear R." before achieving the confidence necessary to compose the full note discovered in Mrs. Ashford's study. The violet perfume that seemed to mark a trail through the house was strongest near the library writing desk, where someone had spent considerable time practicing their deception. Most intriguingly, her inspection of the area around the library desk revealed tiny drops of candle wax that had been carefully cleaned but not entirely removed from the carpet. The pattern suggested someone working by candlelight to avoid detection, taking great care to practice their forgery until it achieved the desired effect. The dedication required for such meticulous preparation spoke of someone with intimate knowledge of the intended victim's habits and expectations. Inspector Craddock's renewed examination of Mrs. Ashford's correspondence, guided by these discoveries, revealed additional layers to the relationship surrounding Whitmore. Hidden among seemingly innocent household letters were communications that exposed a romantic attachment between the widow and her estate manager that extended far beyond professional necessity. Whitmore's letters revealed genuine affection alongside his business assessments, while Mrs. Ashford's carefully composed responses showed a woman torn between emotional attachment and moral awareness of the compromises her situation demanded. The afternoon brought the unexpected return of Mr. Pemberton, whose mysterious absence had raised considerable suspicion throughout the village. The solicitor's explanation for his overnight disappearance proved both revealing and troubling. He had spent the night walking the countryside in a state of moral crisis, wrestling with knowledge that he felt duty-bound to reveal but professionally obligated to conceal. Pemberton's revelation transformed the investigation's understanding of the financial pressures surrounding Greenvale House. As the estate's legal advisor, he had been privy to a clause in the late Mr. Ashford's will that would have disinherited his widow entirely if she remarried within 5 years of his death. This provision, carefully concealed from Mrs. Ashford herself, meant that her romantic relationship with Whitmore posed a direct threat to her continued residence at the family home. The solicitor's account of his movements during the ball provided crucial details that previous testimony had missed. He confirmed wearing the borrowed waistcoat with its distinctive mother-of-pearl buttons and losing one during what he described as a physical altercation near the pond. However, his involvement had been as a witness rather than a participant, arriving at the scene to find two figures already engaged in heated argument over what appeared to be the leather portfolio. Most significantly, Pemberton testified that he had witnessed a third person approaching from the direction of the house, moving with evident purpose and carrying what appeared to be a thin metal rod. The arrival of this third party had transformed the nature of the confrontation entirely, introducing an element of violence that had not been present in the original argument between the first two figures. Miss Marple's careful analysis of this testimony, combined with her accumulated observations, began to reveal the true pattern of events. The violet perfume trail through the house, the repeated practice of the note's opening phrase, the intimate moment at the piano suggested by the crushed petals and fair hair, and the careful placement of evidence all pointed towards someone who had orchestrated events with remarkable precision while maintaining the appearance of innocence. The blue silk thread that had initially seemed to implicate Patricia Thornbury now appeared to be part of a more complex deception. The thread's presence on the pond's rim, combined with the greenhouse rod wrapped in matching silk, suggested someone who had carefully prepared evidence to direct suspicion toward multiple parties, while ensuring that no single suspect would appear definitively guilty. As evening shadows lengthened across Greenvale House's elegant rooms, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological profile of someone capable of such elaborate manipulation. This was not a crime of passion or desperation, but the calculated work of someone who understood human nature well enough to predict how each suspect would react under pressure and how their reactions could be used to obscure the truth. The pattern was finally becoming clear in her methodical mind, though several crucial elements remained to be confirmed before she could be certain of her conclusions. The genuine grief she had observed in one person's reaction to Whitmore's death, The careful attention to misdirection and false evidence, and the intimate knowledge of village relationships all pointed toward a killer who had been hiding in plain sight throughout the investigation. Inspector Craddock, reviewing the day's revelations, found himself facing a case that had evolved far beyond his initial understanding. The simple narrative of financial desperation leading to murder had been replaced by a web of relationships, secrets, and competing motives that seemed to implicate everyone while exonerating no one. Yet he sensed that Miss Marple had perceived something that his methodical approach had missed, some crucial insight into human nature that would finally illuminate the truth. As the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple reflected that the last waltz at Greenvale House had indeed marked the end of innocence for little Wickham. The elegant surface of village propriety had concealed not just dark currents of human nature, but a calculating intelligence that had turned those currents into instruments of murder, while maintaining the perfect appearance of respectability. Tomorrow would bring the moment of final revelation, when all the carefully maintained deceptions would collapse and the real murderer would be exposed. Miss Marple sensed that this confrontation would surprise everyone present, for the true killer was someone whose guilt had been hidden beneath layers of misdirection so subtle that even the most careful investigation had been led astray. The last waltz had ended in murder, but the complex dance of deception was finally approaching its inevitable conclusion. The morning brought an atmosphere of quiet expectancy to Greenvale House, as though the very walls sensed that the complex web of deception was finally approaching its unraveling. Miss Marple, arriving early with the ostensible purpose of helping Mrs. Ashford organize charitable donations for the church bazaar, positioned herself strategically where she could observe the final movements of what she had come to recognize as an elaborately orchestrated performance of innocence. Inspector Craddock's frustration was evident in his methodical review of evidence that seemed to point in multiple directions simultaneously. The revelation of Whitmore's planned confession and restitution, recorded in his hidden journal, had shattered the convenient narrative of blackmail-driven murder. The discovery of digitalis traces in the silver flask, combined with Dr. Thornbury's admission of the victim's heart condition, suggested premeditation of a particularly calculating nature. Yet the physical evidence continued to implicate multiple suspects, while definitively condemning none. Miss Marple had spent considerable time reflecting on the psychological profile of someone capable of such sophisticated manipulation. This would be a person with intimate knowledge of village society, someone trusted and respected, who understood human weaknesses well enough to predict how each suspect would react under pressure. Most significantly, this individual would possess both the intelligence to plan such an elaborate scheme and the emotional detachment necessary to watch others suffer under suspicion for their crime. Her opportunity for a final test came when she requested assistance with addressing envelopes for the church bazaar, a task that required each person to write brief notes in their natural hand. The violet-scented stationery, borrowed from Mrs. Ashford's personal collection, served a dual purpose. As each person wrote, Miss Marple observed not only their handwriting but their reactions to the familiar scent that had marked a trail through the house on the night of the murder. Mrs. Ashford's capital letters retained their graceful, old-fashioned curves, taught by a governess decades earlier. Patricia's script was elegant and controlled, her letters precisely formed despite the stress of recent events. Dr. Thornbury wrote with professional briskness, his medical training evident in the clarity of his penmanship. Robert's nervous energy showed in his hesitant, uneven strokes. Mr. Pemberton's legal background produced careful, economical letters, his capital C reduced to a spare crescent that matched the practiced forgery discovered on the blotter. Most revealing, however, was the reaction to the violet perfume that clung to the stationery. Miss Marple noted how one person's hand trembled almost imperceptibly when handling the scented paper, a minute reaction that spoke of powerful associations with that particular fragrance. The same individual had consistently offered helpful observations throughout the investigation, guiding attention toward various suspects while remaining largely invisible themselves. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple arranged what appeared to be a casual conversation about the tragedy's impact on village life. Her gentle questions about human nature and the psychology of deception elicited responses that revealed more than their speakers intended. She spoke thoughtfully about how remarkable it was that someone could orchestrate such an elaborate scheme while maintaining the perfect appearance of helpful cooperation, watching carefully for the subtle reactions that would confirm her growing certainty. The pattern that emerged from these observations was both elegant and chilling. The killer had not simply committed murder and attempted to cover their tracks. They had actively participated in the investigation, offering insights and evidence that seemed helpful but actually served to obscure the truth. The violet perfume trail, the carefully practiced forgery, the strategic placement of physical evidence, all had been designed to create a web of confusion that would make definitive proof nearly impossible. Miss Marple's years of observing human nature had taught her to recognize the moment when guilt could no longer hide behind the mask of innocence. She detected it now in the slight stiffening of posture when she described the psychological profile of their quarry, the minute adjustment of expression that revealed recognition of exposure. The individual she was watching had believed themselves too clever to be caught, too trusted to be suspected, too helpful to be questioned. The motive, she realized, had been neither financial desperation nor romantic passion, but something far more complex, the calculated preservation of a carefully constructed position in society that Whitmore's knowledge had threatened to destroy. The killer had recognized that his planned confession would expose not just his own past misdeeds, but information that could devastate someone whose respectability was their most precious possession. As evening approached and the house settled into its familiar rhythms, Miss Marple reflected on the sophisticated intelligence that had nearly succeeded in committing the perfect crime. The murderer had understood that the best place to hide was in plain sight, offering assistance to the very investigation seeking to expose them. They had manipulated evidence, guided suspicion, and maintained their facade of helpful concern while watching others suffer under suspicion for their crime. The last waltz at Greenvale House had indeed ended in murder, but the most complex dance had been the killer's elaborate performance of innocence. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, when all the carefully maintained deceptions would collapse and the truth would emerge in all its calculated cruelty. Miss Marple sensed that this revelation would shock everyone present, for the murderer was someone whose guilt had been hidden beneath layers of respectability and helpful cooperation so subtle that even the most careful investigation had been systematically misdirected. The elegant surface of village propriety had concealed not just secrets and scandals, but a calculating mind that had turned the very process of seeking justice into an instrument of continued deception. Yet Miss Marple's patient observation of human nature in all its complexity had finally penetrated the killer's carefully constructed facade, and she prepared herself for the delicate task of exposing a murderer who had hidden their guilt behind the mask of virtue itself. The morning brought Inspector Craddock to Greenvale House with the weight of accumulated evidence pressing upon his methodical mind, while Miss Marple, settling into her familiar observation post near the conservatory windows, sensed that the moment of truth had finally arrived. The autumn air carried that peculiar clarity that comes before significant revelations, and she had learned that such atmospheric shifts often coincided with the exposure of carefully hidden truths. Miss Marple had requested what appeared to be a simple morning gathering to discuss charitable arrangements for James Whitmore's burial. But the assembled participants, Mrs. Ashford still fragile from recent revelations, Patricia maintaining her composed exterior, Robert nervous and defensive, Dr. Thornbury professionally concerned, Helen Carey quietly grieving, and Mr. Pemberton carefully attentive, recognized the subtle tension that marked this as something far more significant. "I believe," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice, "that we have all been participants in a most elaborate performance, though most of us were unaware of our roles. The murder of James Whitmore was not the desperate act of someone cornered by blackmail, as we initially assumed, but rather the calculated work of someone who understood human nature well enough to orchestrate events while maintaining the perfect appearance of helpful cooperation. Inspector Craddock leaned forward with interest as Miss Marple began her methodical elimination of apparent suspects. She addressed Patricia, first acknowledging the blue silk thread that had seemed so damning. "Miss Thornbury, your evening gown was indeed damaged, and you were present in the garden that night. However, you went there as a victim of manipulation, not as a perpetrator. Someone who knew of your past indiscretions arranged for you to be present, ensuring that physical evidence would implicate you." She turned to Robert with equal gentleness. "Mr. Ashford, the note that drew you to the garden—" "My dear, we cannot meet in the house. The garden will be less observed. Bring the portfolio. C.T." was a masterful forgery designed to place you at the scene at precisely the right moment. Your obvious guilt was manufactured by someone who understood how your nervous temperament would appear under scrutiny. Dr. Thornbury received similar consideration. "Doctor, your past knowledge of James Whitworth's activities provided compelling motive, but your genuine distress at his death spoke of professional ethics rather than personal guilt. Your presence near the pond was coincidental, not calculated." Miss Marple's voice took on that particular quality that those who knew her had learned to recognize: gentle but absolutely inexorable. The true pattern of this crime reveals itself not in the obvious motives and apparent evidence, but in the subtle manipulation of all these elements by someone with intimate knowledge of village society and human weakness. She produced from her knitting bag the small velvet case containing the mother-of-pearl button. "Mr. Pemberton, this button came from the waistcoat you borrowed from Mrs. Ashford's late husband's wardrobe. You lost it during your struggle with James Whitmore by the pond, and despite your careful attempts to retrieve it, young Timothy found it the following morning." Pemberton's face had grown progressively paler, but he maintained his professional composure. "Miss Marple, surely you cannot suggest that losing a button constitutes evidence of murder?" "Not the button alone," Miss Marple agreed, "but the button combined with your distinctive speech pattern, that slight whistle on the letters that Timothy heard during the argument by the pond. Your legal training taught you to minimize this impediment, but under stress it becomes quite pronounced." She gestured to the violet-scented stationery she had used for her handwriting test. "You recognized the perfume immediately. It was Mrs. Ashford's personal scent, which you had encountered during your many private consultations about the estate's affairs. Your hand trembled when you handled the paper because it reminded you of the night you practiced forging her handwriting by candlelight in the library." Inspector Craddock was taking careful notes as Miss Marple continued her exposition. "The motive was not simple financial gain, but something far more complex. You had discovered the clause in Mr. Ashford's will that would disinherit his widow upon remarriage. Information you concealed from her while developing your own romantic attachment. James Whitmore's planned confession would have exposed not only his past activities, but your own professional misconduct in concealing crucial information from your client. Most significantly," Miss Marple observed, "you recognized that Whitmore's confession would destroy multiple lives, including your own carefully constructed position in the community. Your legal mind calculated that his death would solve numerous problems simultaneously, protecting Mrs. Ashford from financial ruin, preserving your professional reputation, and eliminating the obstacle to your own romantic aspirations." She described how Pemberton had orchestrated the evening's events with meticulous precision. The forged note drawing Robert to the garden, the careful timing to ensure multiple suspects would be present, the placement of evidence to implicate others, all had been designed to create a web of confusion while he remained above suspicion as the helpful legal advisor. "The digitalis in Whitmore's flask was your contribution," Miss Marple explained. "Your access to Mrs. Ashford's medical supplies, combined with your knowledge of the victim's heart condition from reviewing his insurance documents, provided both means and method. The blow with the greenhouse rod was delivered when the medication failed to act quickly enough. Mr. Pemberton's professional facade finally cracked under the weight of Miss Marple's gentle but relentless exposition. His confession, when it came, revealed the full extent of his calculated manipulation. He had indeed developed romantic feelings for Mrs. Ashford while managing her legal affairs, and Whitmore's presence had threatened not only his professional standing but his personal hopes for their future together. "I never intended for it to go so far," he admitted, his voice carrying that telltale whistle that had betrayed him. But James was determined to confess everything, regardless of the consequences to others. He couldn't see that his redemption would destroy innocent people. Mrs. Ashford, the young people whose secrets he had uncovered, even myself. Inspector Craddock's arrest of Mr. Pemberton brought a somber conclusion to the investigation that had revealed so much about the hidden currents flowing beneath the surface of village respectability. The elegant facade of Little Wickham society had concealed not just secrets and scandals, but a calculating mind that had turned the very process of seeking justice into an instrument of continued deception. As the morning drew to a close and the participants dispersed to process the shocking revelation, Miss Marple reflected that the last waltz at Greenvale House had indeed marked the end of innocence for the community. The tragedy had exposed the price of secrets and the lengths to which someone would go to preserve a carefully constructed facade of professional respectability and personal ambition. The most sobering aspect of the case was how nearly Pemberton had succeeded in his elaborate deception. His understanding of human nature, combined with his position of trust within the community, had enabled him to manipulate the investigation while maintaining the appearance of helpful cooperation. Only the accumulated weight of small observations, the mother-of-pearl button, the distinctive speech pattern, the tremor when handling violet-scented paper, the two convenient legal insights, had finally revealed the truth beneath his mask of professional propriety. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to her cottage, knowing that Little Wickham would eventually heal from this tragedy, though the community would never again view their trusted advisers with quite the same unquestioning faith. The last waltz had ended in murder, but justice had finally prevailed through the patient observation of human nature in all its complexity. The dance of village life would continue, but with the sobering knowledge that even the most respectable facades could conceal the darkest of calculations, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators were those who offered to help. As she walked through the autumn garden where tragedy had unfolded, Miss Marple reflected that the true mystery had not been who killed James Whitmore, but how completely someone could hide their guilt behind a mask of virtue and professional competence. The last waltz at the Manor had indeed ended, but its haunting melody would linger in the memory of Little Wickham for years to come.